This conference will now be recorded.
Thank you. So, well, it's 9:02. We'll call this meeting to order. And we will begin by citing and saying this pledge of allegiance. If you'll all stand and face the flag. Ready to begin? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Let's do roll call, shall we? Director Johnson.
Here.
Director Johnson. Here. Vice President Baker from
We're in Virginia.
Purcellville, Virginia.
Oh,
Purcellville Public Library. Here's the public library. Here's the posted agenda.
Inside voice, Patty.
very nice.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for being here.
And President Dice.
I'm here.
And then Director Moran is off at the Aqua Conference, as well as Jessica today. They're here in spirit. GPIA meeting.
I have to say, I am due to the fact that they're in Monterey. Okay, so we have an agenda before us, and if there are no objections or emergency updates, I would like to hear a motion to approve it. So moved. Thank you. So we have a motion to approve the agenda. So if there are no objections from the public, I will call the roll. Director Baker?
Aye.
Thank you. Director Johnson? Aye. Director Duncan?
Aye.
And I also approve. So we have an agenda. Do we have any comments from the public? Requests for future agenda items? I don't know. Who do we have?
Kathy Melky.
All right. Hearing
Is
nobody.
Gina dialed in?
Yeah, she's gonna listen to all of the meeting until she has.
Oh, good.
She's not participating.
She's not a participant, so did listen.
She can hear good.
Are there any comments from the directors? Are you enjoying yourself in the East Coast, Tammy?
Yeah, the flowers are amazing.
Really?
Irises, all sorts of things we don't have.
Well, that's a treat. Okay, correspondence. Okay, so we'll go down to section 2, the items for board consideration and possible action. And 2A is the groundwater dependent ecosystems technical memo and potential center use.
Well, thank you, Madam President. Today, we have the pleasure of having Travis Huxman from UCI here to chat about a very important topic to BWD and all of us, the community and Mother Nature and the ecosystem all combined. And that is, as part of the Prop 68 grant, UCI received approval for a project to evaluate the groundwater dependent ecosystem status. I'll let Travis talk about everything technical, but so Travis and his team has started the work, and they've actually issued a technical memorandum that I think was in our packet last meeting. And that's basically the literature search of what's happened, and they found some interesting results, I think, already, without even doing any quote unquote research of their own, any new research. And then Travis and I forget who was on the call, well, a week or so ago, and just Travis was describing how he felt there was some potential synergies between GDEs and the future of GDEs and other uses, to where you ask the person on the street and the typical person would not see a potential connection and might even think those are opposing interests. Boy, any water dedicated to the environment is less water for others. So as Travis was explaining his approach and his theory and a really unique approach of looking at this very complicated issue, I thought, man, it would be great for the whole board to hear that. And so here he is.
Thank
So
you.
thank you
Enough
for
pie,
that,
enough pie for everybody?
Travis.
There isn't a pie for everyone. Thank you. Well, thank you for having me come and talk to you. And I have a PDF up here of a presentation. It may be hard to see, so we can go slow, but some of the figures are things you've seen before, or I have it on my laptop. Look at it at the same time.
I'm good.
You're good? Okay.
So
So,
maybe we can.
Yeah,
That's
one
good.
sets off, that's.
yeah, you can send it around. It's for consumption. And, I just want to remind you that a little bit about who I am, and I'll dive into it. So I'm a physiological ecologist, and I'm at UCI, and I've spent 30 years basically studying how plants use water in deserts. And so that's intersected with water issues in basins, or climate change, or land use, or invasive. It's sort of intersected with all kinds of different topics. And it's put me in a position often of being someone who bridges the geophysical world, the hydrology world, the atmospheric science world, and then the social, economic sort of world of the West. And so I end up being often in this, like, these nexus points. And my goal here today is to, do what Jeff asked me to do, which is in part to talk about the technical memorandum. And there's a lot of text on my slide about this, but the basin is entering into a bunch of what will be value choices that have to be carried out as a collective. And so the goal in talking about the technical memorandum is really about creating a common language so that when you make those value choices, there aren't apparent trade-offs that are driving people's opinion. The second goal is to deal with this issue of synergies. I've lived in this Western water wars world for a very long time, as we all have, and actually we know one thing from the way that groups enter into these like decisions about giving up all the water, and that's that there are winners and losers when you take this Western water war approach. Eleanor Ostrom, the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics, showed us this. Like she demonstrated this. And so there are other ways, and it's important for us to start thinking about those other ways that are more equitable. And then the last is, and I've made tours like this before, is just to remind you that, I represent the university, and we consider ourselves to be essentially public servants, right? So we have this Prop 68 funding to do the work in the desert, but absent that funding, we would still be available for the public. And the institution thinks of itself like a fire department, like a police department, like one of those public service entities that's there for communities when they need someone to help them bring good science practice to a problem. And so that's really important to what I am doing. And so I often think about the problem beyond just the scope of the grant, because there are aspects that are not grant related that are really important. So of course I'm here to talk about groundwater dependent ecosystems, which is like the fourth slide now, I think somewhere down the list, if you can scroll down to the pretty picture. And so these are, you can actually just go to the next one. Of course, everyone in here knows that groundwater dependent ecosystems are called out in SGMA and are defined as beneficial users when they're identified as part of a basin that's planning for a sustainable management plan. And they're called out not because they potentially use a large mass of water, but they're called out because they have their unique feature that relates to the environment that can suffer potentially undesirable outcome. And so in most settings, it's easy to understand what a groundwater dependent ecosystem is, because surface waters tell us that there are groundwater connections in places. And so the figure on the left really is that. It's the riparian zones that are obvious and seemingly connected and make a lot of sense. But in our Western world and in these Western basins, the surface waters don't tell us a lot often. And so where and how those groundwater dependent ecosystems are is difficult. And it often really results in conflict because people don't agree on their existence, their presence, or their role in the system. In fact, I saw something really funny in your restroom. And I think this highlights it.
One?
Yeah, so it highlights it. So first of all, it's great to ever be in a restroom where there are maps of water systems. So that's so like this
Like
is
the 1960s
a minor
map.
criticism.
Oh, I love those maps.
Yeah, but the Colorado Basin one, of course, shows the San Pedro River in southern Arizona starting at about Wilcox, 40 or 50 miles away from the border with Mexico. Actually, the San Pedro River crosses and extends, 20 or 30 miles in Mexico and flows north into the state of Arizona. And so there's this huge, highlands in Mexico that delivers water to the Colorado River Basin to the north. And it's absent on the map because it's like a convenient, oh, that doesn't exist sort of thing. They don't draw that on the map. And it reminds me of how we think about groundwater and ecosystems in arid basins. It's convenient if they're not present for the most part. And then if you go to the next slide, just this conceptual figure, and I highlight this out, that GDEs are a problem in Western basins, based on the way we approach thinking about Western basins. We like to think of Western basins as being simple buckets. They're homogeneous, where we can think about groundwater elevation, and we can partition the water nicely amongst the different potential users. And we can use that kind of budgeting approach to think about how and where our water should and could go. And these GDEs actually, they are living structures that muck up a very pretty physical system. So if you're an engineer, you're really happy with the bucket because it solves nicely. And if you're a life scientist, it's frustrating because there are these little entities that actually change the nature of the basin entirely. And so that actually, the conceptual model for the basin actually works against thinking about how GDEs perform in the basin. And that's really sort of an important thing to remember as we go through this. And in fact, if you go to the next slide, as a result of that kind of conceptualization, the planning process for the GMP really determined that there were no GDEs of critical value in the basin. And it had this famous Appendix 4D of the plan, sort of outlines the argument and demonstrates in that analysis that what we would call the GDE of interest in Borrego Springs, which is the Mesquite Bosque near the sink that extends north towards the airport, is limited in scale, small. That the rooting systems of these plants don't extend to the groundwater, and that the health of the system is suspect. It looks bad, and it's had a sort of this declining trend through time based on everyone's perception and some remote sensing analysis. And that seems really reasonable when you use that conceptual model as your framework to think about it. So our grant is really focused at analyzing, determining the presence of GDEs, using multiple approaches, and then trying to understand their role in the basin and develop a monitoring plan for them. And so our first exercise was just simply going through the GMP, the planning process, and trying to understand what we know and what we don't know, what were speculations, what were decent analyses, and where are there data that can relate to the problem. So if you go to the next one, I'm just going to walk through these three issues that were in the argument that there were no GDEs. And so the original planning process used this product from the state of California and from the Nature Conservancy to try to identify groundwater dependent ecosystems. It was a mapping process that is supposed to be used as a blanket to understand potential areas in the West. It's a data product that works at the scale of counties and above in terms of trying to understand where these sensitive species might be. And it really was meant to be a starting point, but in the case of Borrego Springs, it was used as a kind of determinant point. So if you go to the next slide, that data product, the NCCAG mapping product essentially shows a very small portion of what is potential GDEs in the system that's sort of just inside the state park boundary, just east of the sink, and has this really, funny feature that our postdocs discovered, which was an incredible straight line through it. Some of you have heard this story before, but going through it again is important. That straight line is suspicious. And so when we look closer at the data set, if you go to the next slide, we see that the data set is really, it was built on publicly available vegetation data sets that are from places like state parks or regional vegetation assessments, and they miss lots of data within counties where there are actually interesting vegetation assemblages. That was the case here, where the donut hole of Borrego Springs was absent from this data set, including some other places. And if you go to the next slide, when the postdocs on our project reanalyzed the data and used county data and were up-to-date vegetation analysis, we found that there were almost 2 orders of magnitude greater land area that was represented by mesquite and potential GDEs in the basin as compared to the original assessment. So there were some other technical issues about the scaling and the spatial scope in the GDE, in GMP, but this idea that GDEs go from being a very minor player on the land surface to something that's actually, when you calculate the evapotranspiration from 2,600 acres of GDE, it's a tremendous amount of the water budget of the basin. So it's at least worth looking into deeply. So if we continue down, the second point that was made in the analysis to kind of reject the presence of GDEs was about rooting distribution. And the GMP planning process sort of determined that the mesquite have this maximum rooting capacity in the basin of about 15.5 feet. That actually comes from a reference in the original USGS assessment that use model flow to describe the groundwater basin here. And it was a model parameter, and it actually was an error in the model that when we approached the authors, they discovered when they dug through their tables. And so that is not a real number. Mesquite can produce roots to extreme depths. And if we go to the next slide, there's data from the valley, from peer-reviewed literature. Walt Whitford, this was an important, what was called the IBGP project, looking at desert ecosystems, and it showed, in the valley that there were roots present in about 40 feet below the land surface near the sink, and that was presumably the groundwater elevation at the time. Doesn't mean that that's the limit to what these roots could do, but it's what was measured at the sink. We know from the literature that mesquite have roots to hundreds of feet from these observations in mines and in caves throughout the West. And we know there are other species that can put roots to incredible depths, greater than probably what mesquite can do, including that Tamara's cave phillip that's sitting out there on all the roadsides. If you go to the next slide. And none of this is shocking. This is like, I'm a plant person. I study plants. And so here's a state park gym, the stratospheric giant. It's over 300 feet tall. And, water is transported in that system over 100 meters by against the forces of gravity. This is not shocking for a plant biologist, but there is an enormous tension between in the water world between people who study subsurface processes and people who study surface processes, and they tend to not talk. And so this kind of thing happens repeatedly in basins. It is likely that there are many places in the basin where roots have their toes, plants have their toes in the groundwater. So it's not shocking at all. If we go to the next slide, when you take those different rooting distributions and you just look at what they mean for access to groundwater across the basin, you can find many locations where there's the potential for roots to be interfacing with the groundwater. And what we did here was a provocative analysis that's supposed to come back to this conceptual design, or this conceptual model we have of the basin. We took the groundwater elevations that West Yost produced as a process of determining storage in the basin. So this is like the way that we get to sustainable yield in the basin. This is the way that we decide in the water master structure how we're going to divvy up all the water. We took those elevations, and we took a modern digital elevation map of the land surface and just subtracted the two. And the result is, much of the mesquite bosque is in locations where roots could be accessing groundwater. So this, even the product from the contractors of the water master are telling us that there's this potential for GDE presence in the basin. It doesn't mean that they are, but it means the potential is there for that. And we have a summary slide or two that you can see in the technical memorandum that describes that. And again, the point just being that if we start from thinking of the landscape as a bucket, and it has an on average land surface elevation, has an on average groundwater elevation, roots can do on average something. We kind of come to this idea that GDEs are probably a small player in the basin. If we think about the nuance of the plants, if we think about the real spatial heterogeneity of the landscape, we start to get to this idea that there could be pockets of really important GDE. And then, of course, there are places where there's no presence, or there is declining ecosystems of that nature. Okay. The final point from the sort of thinking about the presence of GDE is way down to number 3, is thinking about the use of remote sensing to determine vegetation health. And so in the planning process, the tool that was used was a MODIS product looking at greenness and looking at a time series of greenness from a satellite. It's this GDE pulse data set. It was a powerful tool 20 or 30 years ago, and it's not necessarily the most powerful now. And the idea was simply to look at the land surface when there are dry periods and identify areas that continue to be green or increase in greenness through that time as indicative of places where plants are using groundwater, the source of water that they would have. And the results are on the next figure, which show that that little tiny area that was only included in the GMP process, adjacent to the sink, basically shows no change through time from the 1980s to 2017 or so. It's the little pale colored polygons that are on the map there. So they show no change through time. And of course, I already told you this is a limited scope. It's not the whole area that was of interest to what are real mesquite on the landscape. And it shows this odd thing, which is that it actually stays the same through time, which doesn't mean that it's not declining or increasing. It's just staying the same. If you go to the next slide, we can highlight sort of the nuance of this. What we feel is this really has a nuance that's missing from the local context. The first is that our sites are heterogeneous. This MODIS product operates at a big scale. Oh, we went too far, I think. There we go. And then, there are more modern products that actually let us pick out individual plants as compared to these big 30 meter by 30 meter swaths of land that give us a funny signal. And the second is that this tool looks at these ecosystems in the summer months, which are supposed to be dry, and they are for most of the West. But that darn monsoonal line actually swings this far into the lower deserts across the West and in the lower deserts. And it actually ends up being a time where we expect there to be surface water inputs into the system. And we expect even riparian systems to be using those surface waters as compared to groundwater. And so there are better times to be digging into this. So the take home from it really is, from the whole planning process, which is the next one, is that, there was this idea that the GDEs are limited in spatial scope. And that's just simply not true. They're probably 2 orders of magnitude larger in size. There's this idea that they had limit in their ability to put roots to depth and access groundwater. And that's simply not true. There's an order of magnitude greater depth of roots. And then there was this idea that the health was suspect. But that analysis was so constrained, and it was not reflective of like what this ecosystem is, that that's not actually true. And the data actually shows that it was stable through time, which is, just doesn't match the interpretation from the planning process. And so the end result, in the next slide, is that most of the data that was available at the time suggests that there are groundwater dependent ecosystems in the basin, that they're substantial and they're spatially expansive. We need to know the magnitude of water extraction and the timing of water extraction to really understand the water budget implications and the way it behaves in the budget. And this really needs to be put in context. Like the exclusion of GDPs and the use of this kind of bucket model for divvying up the water create this conflict between thinking about GDPs in the landscape and how water is divvied up. And so this all really needs some contextualization. And that's our goal. So if you go to the next slide. So our plans for the coming year and a half or so are to first to quantitatively assess how much groundwater the plants are using. So we do that using stable isotopes of hydrogen and oxygen and water. We basically extract water from plants, their tissues, and we look at the stable isotopic composition of the molecules of water, and we can compare that to the isotopic composition of groundwater versus that of recent rainfall. And it lets us just simply create a map across the basin of who has groundwater in their leaves. This is like the easiest, it's water fingerprinting across the basin. Next slide. And then, we need to improve our maps of where these potential systems are. So we're using just more modern aerial photography and remote sensing to get a better understanding of what is potential GD and what's not. And it's obvious that there are some horrible, unhealthy looking stands of mesquite out there. And then there are other areas that are glorious and full of life. And what we have in the basin is a really complex adaptive system where, what was 50 years ago is now very different. Surface water flows out of Coyote Creek and out of Palm Canyon are very different. And the ecosystems that relied on those surface water flows have changed. And we're seeing death from that. The mesquite have aged in some places, and because they've aged, they become prone to disease and mistletoe infection. And we're seeing effects of that. And in some places, there's been groundwater decline, and we're seeing effects of that. And so the idea will be really how we map all of those things together to try to understand where are real active GDEs with the potential for conservation. So we go to the next slide. And then finally, we'll sort of wrap this together with more modern and sophisticated remote sensing with ground truth data. We already have data we're collecting from weather stations and soil moisture stations throughout the basin and Clark Lake as a comparison. And that'll just give us more hands-on understanding of like what are the magnitude of these ecosystems in the basin. Okay. So that's the science. And we're through our first isotopic analysis, we should have data by summer. We'll do another round of data collection in June. And then we repeat some of this through the next year while we refine our maps. But that's only part of what I think we were talking about on the phone the other day and what I wanted to talk about. I just wanted to cover the technical memorandum. Yeah, and so this is what I want to talk about, is the next set of slides. Because I think there are some things that we can do in the community to really put this in context. So the bucket conceptual model that we use is powerful. It's powerful when the groundwater system works on average. And so I use our bucket model. I use the analogy of our bank account, like a personal bank account, to think about how this works. Many people are comfortable just knowing that there's a certain amount of money in their bank account. And if it drops below a certain level, they do something. But, you know, I have a different kind of job. I know I have tenure at a university. I know I have a paycheck coming all the time. So I don't really care if there's a lot of money or little money in my bank account. I just don't want it to ever go to zero. I'm going to get paid every month. Right? So my personal model, thinking about my groundwater basin, is very different because I'm interested in different parts of the processes that govern the groundwater elevation. And so this focus on groundwater elevation as the proxy variable that tells us something about storage, it creates some blinders for how we think about how the basin works. And I'm going to try to talk about some of the blinders. The biggest is that it only works during times of stationarity. If things change, then trying to understand just the elevation of the groundwater doesn't tell us what the system is doing. It only works during periods of stationarity. And we know things are changing dramatically. Barbs are fallowing, climate's changing, water use is changing through efficiencies, plants are dying, everything is changing at this point in time. So if you go to the next slide. So I like to think about conceptual models and how they're limited. The first thing you do is you challenge it with something it wasn't intended for. So the conceptual model, the mod flow scheme, produces the groundwater elevation contour through its simple splining. The water master had the contractor carry that out. They did that. And so we said, great, if that works so great for storage and you feel comfortable with that, let's use it for a different use. And our different use was where can roots access the groundwater? When we showed this figure to people, they immediately went, oh my God, no, that can't be right. It's way more heterogeneous than that. Well, this is a fallacy. Like you can't have one and not the other, right? Like you got to decide. And they both have error in estimates about it, but which should you choose? So if you're going to use it for determining groundwater elevation, then it's good enough for these other things too, right? Or there's something different about the two processes that you have to interrogate. I kind of think it's okay. It's okay on average to think about storage in this way, but that's not enough to think about these other things, which requires the use of other models. So the point being that you just have to be careful of the use of proxy variables. And the bucket model makes us focus so much on groundwater elevation as the proxy variable of interest. So if you go to the next one. This one's a little more nuanced, and I'll talk offline if you want to about that. But using that model creates limiting definitions. You already put a box around your system, and it changes the way you think about different parts of the box. An example of this is the potential groundwater dependent ecosystems that are at the mountain fronts. So in the planning documents, the groundwater dependent ecosystems in Coyote Canyon and Palm Canyon, at the mountain fronts are excluded from potential beneficial users in the system because the focus is on groundwater elevation. And the argument is that any pumping has limited effect on these ecosystems, or these ecosystems, if we remove them, have limited effect on groundwater pumping and the average elevation. This is a fallacy. If one of my students made this argument in one of my classes, it's a fallacy of causation because these are complex adaptive systems. One is not leading to the other. They're spatially explicit. They are interactive, but it's a fallacy. It's not true. And because you're thinking about the bucket, the fallacy seems consistent and you're able to accept it. And so, again, this is also you can't have your cake and eat it too. It's claiming that these ecosystems are being supported by drainage from the mountain system, from the upper watershed, and that thus they're not part of the groundwater system, except the groundwater system is a function of the drainage and the upper system. So you can have one or the other, but not both. It also makes a fallacy associated with how we know groundwater and surface water interact. And this is where the technical issue, where the surface water people, the groundwater people just don't talk to each other. I mean, literally, I'm in departments where some sit on that half of the building and the others sit on that half of the building, and they do not talk to each other. They don't even use the same map. Like, they just don't talk to each other. And the reality is that there is this coupling of recharge and groundwater depth and recharge and the presence of these plants. So,
Travis, one sec, would you say again, name the groups that don't talk to each other?
so the people who don't talk to each other, the groundwater hydrologists, subsurface hydrologists, they're often geophysical folks that use a certain mass balance modeling, like mod flow, to understand how a system works. The alternative are the surface water hydrologists and micrometeorologists who use an entirely different framework for understanding how basins work. It's based on not mass balance, but what drives the exchange of water. How humid is it, how arid is it, and where water is. So these are, they really don't talk to each other. And in fact, in the Earth system models, they have this little fixed place in the model where they fix the way these two models talk to each other. And it's yeah.
Can I ask where do soil scientists fall in that? Well, it's not a continuum,
But yeah, so soil scientists, again, there are soil scientists who look at the world like a bucket and they think of these basins as homogeneous and simplistic. And then there are soil scientists who are like our Western geomorphologists who think a lot about landscape evolution. And the traditional soil scientists sort of align with the groundwater hydrologists. The geomorphic evolution folks are the ones who tend to think about the surface water hydrology, and they align in that way. And then, yeah.
You've articulated well the fact that these two groups do not speak to each other.
Yeah.
And you're quite forward about making that statement. From the outside looking in, as a common sense layman, what is the reason that they won't speak to each other?
It's often that they get different answers in their assessments of a system. And their users are not often happy with the different answers.
Different science?
No. Well, no, it's the same science, but they're coming at the question from a different perspective with different tools. And so they're each missing things. I like to think of it like the blind men touching the elephant.
Right.
And that is the truth. Some of the groundwater folks are holding the legs and the surface water folks are holding the truck. And they can't come to terms with what the organism is that they
But
have.
over
together.
time, hasn't there been a referee created who resolves these?
Yeah,
Refusals to speak to each other?
it just takes time, but it takes time. It is moving forward. In fact, I have a graduate student who just wrote this really wonderful, previous graduate student, he's a full professor in Arizona now, who just wrote this paper on why the models don't interact and why they over or under predict depending on the perspective.
Do you, as a professor, favor one philosophy?
No, they're both wonderful folks. Like the folks who use the mod flow, and they're super smart. They are in the 50s and 60s, you either went in, if you were a super smart math person, you went into engineering and you did aerospace, or you became one of these like groundwater modeling folks. I mean, they're super smart, but they're in that world. But that's their world, right? And there is a different set of folks that are younger who do this other stuff. So anyway, but it leads to these kind of blind spots of my big thing. The one, if you go to the next slide, the blind spots like perpetuate. And so what we were talking about was Refarm on the phone. Refarm is the project, this other Prop 68 project, looking at fallowing of ag lands. So that project is framed in the terms of reducing the risk of fallowing to regional air quality and to erosion and to community-wide impacts. Why would a farmer want to fallow land? What are the best practices for that? How do I mitigate potential risks that come from fallowing the land? It's looked at in terms of a cost. And that is looked at in terms of cost because of this, where we've entered this discussion. The reality is that there are plants on those landscapes using water that would be recharging to the groundwater system if they weren't there. There are benefits to the water budget that come from refouling, rather than just looking at it as if what happens if I turn off the sprinklers on my lands. There's also this perspective from the surface about potential down the road. It's clear the federal government's put in a tremendous amount of money in the next 10 years sort of time horizon of budgeting to look at fallowing across the West. And the needs, the goals are like 1 million acres of fallowing of ag farmland in the West, along with efficiencies and other things in ag. There's incredible incentive around this that'll be coming online in the next few years, to the point where you might, as a farmer, right now you're sitting in a world of uncertainty. Your water rights and your land rights are risky, right? There's uncertainty around them. Owning them means you got to figure out how to cut them by 80%. Maybe you can, maybe they have value now if you use them in this period of uncertainty to give a user who really wants to worry about their efficiencies, access to your water rights. But then you got to fallow the land, which is potentially a risk. That perspective 10 years from now is one where there may be revenue sources associated with fallowing, along with efficiencies. Where a farmer who makes it through this little valley of what is an apparent lack of value and uncertainty might end up in a setting where there's tremendous value in their lands and in their water rights. So we know, and this goes back to the sort of water wars in the West, in periods of uncertainty in these water wars, that's what creates winners and losers. It's because people act without full knowledge of the value of what they hold or what the community sees as the value. And so, again, our conceptual model is sort of framing this to where even projects like our refarm project, which is a tremendous opportunity for the ag region, may not be seeing its full potential just because it's existing in this period of uncertainty where the focus on groundwater elevation is constraining how people think about it. Okay, so the next thing, the things that we think we'd like to do in the university is just foster a couple of things. And to remind people that when the models fail, that's an opportunity to look for opportunity. So the presence of GDEs in the basin, which we're fairly confident of, when the model says there shouldn't be, means that something is wrong with the model. And in this case, the thought process is likely recharge is much greater than we think in this basin. Ephemeral recharge and preferential flow recharge. So these are opportunities, right? Like that people could take advantage of.
Would you mind defining preferential flow recharge?
So we think of preferential flow recharge is happening through the macroforest structure that is created on a real landscape. So that's like where a root has put down a channel. The soil and the root never perfectly touch. And so they act as conduits for water to flow.
Tiny little,
Yeah.
okay.
The model doesn't have that. The model pretends that the soil in a column in a mod flow cell is homogeneous and it's just soil. It doesn't have these preferential flows. Focused channel-based recharge can happen near the mountain fronts, or it can happen in the sink, right? Where flow results in small area, hot spots of potential recharge that have big mass effects on the basin. Likely the burns in 2002, 2003 in the upper watershed led to massive flows of water on the surface to the sink and to other parts of the valley that had bigger recharge effects. So these are all like opportunities to think about how to do. So I understand that, the fallowing of land and the acquiring of land, especially around Coyote Creek, could change the nature of channels considerably in that area, which which at first glance, like back of the envelope, should have an impact on recharge. So it's not just about turning off pumping on those landscapes. It's about affecting recharge too. But other things, the wastewater treatment plant. When the wastewater treatment plant was planned, we did not believe that you could just put water on the surfaces and see considerable flow to groundwater. We know now that's not true. Throughout the central water projects in Arizona, the wastewater treatments in Southern California, we know that there's tremendous recharge and flow from detention basins, much greater than we thought 20 years ago. The idea of these macropore structures, the acreage of things like salt cedar in the basin, the use of facultative rhyophytes, ones that might also be leaked out during periods when we could expect recharge, like those could all have impacts on the basin, on recharge in the basin. I think from my back of the envelope calculated, there's like a couple hundred acres of salt cedar in the basin. Those things don't stop transpiring in the winter. They use water all year long. And so there's a real potential there for management that has an impact not only on the extraction of water, but also on the potential for recharge in the basin. And so getting people to think about those other things, where the model fails, shows us opportunities for action, essentially. And so my goal is to think about expanding conceptual models. We know that decision-making by multiple diverse stakeholders works best when they own a way of thinking about the system. And so rather than, while it's nice for us to think about one common conceptual model, what helps is for us to have lots of toy models about how we put these things together in our own minds so that we can make informed decisions. Sponsoring that, the Water District is one of the few groups that has a diverse set of perspectives where your stakeholders may actually have different ways of thinking about how the water is used in the basin. We would like to. And so I have an analogy that I use, and I'll stop after this. Because I told you I could talk forever. My analogy, and to sort of highlight the need for multiple models to think about this, is to think about it works here, doesn't work in all settings, is the idea of the broken fuel gauge on your car. So my first car had no fuel gauge. Right? It was a Volkswagen. You could peer in the gas tank straight down, and stick your finger in it and see if there's gas there. But the point being there is that if the lack of a fuel gauge doesn't mean you don't can't make decisions about how you drive your car, where you drive your car, and how. But how you do it actually is nuanced, and there is risk and opportunity in how you do it. So if you go to this next slide, so how do you do it? You keep track of the miles you've driven. You keep track of what gear you drive in. You keep track of the speeds you drive. You keep track of the hours your engine runs. I have a boat. That's what we keep track of, the hours of engine run. And then you keep track of how you fill your car up, or you stick your finger in it. And every one of these ways of doing it has error. But it's all of them together that help you understand, the way that the car is, and whether it's risky to drive to see the Grand Canyon when you're 15 on a car that doesn't have a gas tank or a gas fuel gauge. But the way it works here is that you have to remember that things are changing. Like this car, the car you're driving, you're driving uphill, downhill, in the wind, on dirt, and then, all of a sudden with climate change and these new regulations that are coming down, really in a non-stationary period, this car is now also like a plug-in hybrid at the same time. So you're measuring how much gas is in the tank, but you also have this other battery type thing. So the only way to really, think about this as a community is really to empower people to develop their own toy models to use to think about how water works in this basin. Because then they'll make good choices. Or at least, and good choices in my world are the choices that reflect the values of the stakeholders. Because that is what they want. The farmers Some of the farmers want to get out of the business. Some of the farmers want it to be a legacy business. Some of the farmers want to grow their business. People in the basin, some people want to use more water. Some people want to make their houses more efficient, right? Like there are all these potential values that are being expressed, but if people aren't working in a world of certainty where they can also see what their decisions make in the context of the system, then they're going to make poor decisions. And I'll just go to the last figure, which really is about reminding you, we need this because the system is not a bucket. The groundwater, the Borrego hydrologic model is a wonderful tool, but it is like the first step at thinking about water because there's complex geography, there's complex geology in the basin, and how we make choices about what we want in the future in different locations really, really matters. So if we could get De Anza to remove that little detention basin and let water actually flow all the way down into, across to Georgia Road and across over south of the airport, I'm like convinced as a plant biologist that most of the bosque would return, right? Like that surface water flow actually matters. But the exciting thing is that like the mesquite around the wastewater treatment plant, holy moly, it's like if you look at the remote sensing, there's a whole ecosystem that's grown there since the 70s, right? These are opportunities, and the only way we can get at it all is if we're really encouraging people to like own their own little piece of it.
Right.
Yeah.
It's time, we can ask a question.
Sorry, you guys tolerated me talking, so you can ask questions.
My question is trying to expand this. If we're looking at the trees, because we're residents of Borrego Springs, perhaps we could ask you to look at the forest briefly. We have a small community and a small geographical basin. What, in your opinion, is either unique or special about Borrego Springs? We think it's special, but what is it that you think is special about Borrego Springs?
Well, what floats my boat are tough questions. So I think this is actually the scale of the size of the basin, the diversity of the community, where these things called wicked problems get solved, which means that this is any bigger and one industry or sector would take over, and like ag or recreation or whatever you could tell about, right? Like or you'd be Imperial Valley. Any smaller and any one person again would have tremendous potential to take over and make decisions for the community. But this community and this basin is like the perfect size for collective decision making. You see people in the grocery store, you're all on the same like boards of directors of different organizations. First time I came here, I met with ABF, and they wanted to meet with the Botany Society about something else. And so I came back a week later, and it was like the same people sitting in different places around the ditch. Like, why didn't we just talk last week? That's wonderful. So I think that this community is that size, right?
That's a very encouraging answer because it means that we are not just a guinea pig community, but rather we have a stasis here that is not optimal, but certainly very, very positive.
Yeah, and when I back the envelope, calculate the water budget, like there are tools in every sector to really balance it so that there are legacies of every sector, right? Which is exciting.
Yeah.
So the challenge is to have buy-in from the other users in this basin as to how GDEs will benefit them. And also, how would we get people off the idea of the bucket or the pie? How do we move people off of that and into a bigger outlook?
I think that individual, like thinking about people's individual values is the way, because the bucket like on average serves everyone. which means that it doesn't serve a lot of people. And so really talking about the way that it doesn't serve some people is key. You know, if you pick something like rec, and you think about golf and rec and the broader recreation, you know, their toy model might have an economic component to it. It's about how do you avoid being a seasonal resort town, right? And that brings in a whole different set of ways of looking at the water that's outside of the bucket entirely. They have a fraction of water. How do they want to spend it if they don't want it? They don't want to be, you know, like the Southwest equivalent of ski town, where everyone's broke and out of work. In the summer, kids are moving away, right? But they need the room to do that. I think ag's the same way.
Well, the board and Jeff may not answer this question, but I don't. I'm looking at this from the outside. What is your role right now? Are you employed by just the university system?
Yeah.
What do you do?
I'm just a professor at a university.
But
And I'm a scientist, but we have a contract, a grant from the state to just measure the presence of these groundwater dependent ecosystems.
in Borrego Springs?
In Borrego Springs.
It's part of that Proposition 68 grant, the $6.1 million that you have probably read about. That was one of the components.
It's important to know that GDEs go back to SIGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. You know, we didn't make it, I mean, it's important, and God bless that it's in there, but the evaluation of groundwater dependent ecosystems was a requirement.
And is there going to be a recommendation, or is there going to be action? Is it the university system? Who's going to be taking action on what he is educating us to?
As of right now, the funding of his study has occurred. So there's state funding, Proposition 68 money to complete Travis's study. This is just the beginning. This is kind of the lay person's terms of the literature search, and obviously it was a lot more than that. They've thought about what the previous literature, and I guess some current mapping and other tools, but without doing kind of any new research. The isotopes and the other techniques, the different mapping, resolutions and all that, that's all going to be happening over the next year and a half. So I think they will come up with a conclusion. I'm sure it won't be a yes or a no. It'll maybe Travis can explain like how he sees the process.
Is that the university system or the state?
Yes, university system.
And you've got the whole state of California is involved, I guess, in some ways. Will the state be taking some action at some point regarding Borrego Springs?
This,
The water master.
yeah, so this recommendation will be delivered to the water master through the water district.
Yes.
We hope.
Yes.
And, and to the extent they're involved, the Department of Water Resources at the state, but it will also go to all the individual stakeholders in the basin. So, you know, the state park, school district, the different groups, because they all individually make decisions through the water master.
But I was kind of more asking for Travis's input on the expectations of the study. So what do you expect
So I expect that we
for
have,
the next year and a half?
so here next year and a half, I expect that we deliver maps of like current use of groundwater by vegetation, so that they can be understood spatially. That we have a good idea of the order of magnitude mass use of water, so how much of the water budget is in the basin is coming from GDEs. And that we have a monitoring plan for that. So how do we continue to just watch that activity through time? And then the final is that I think we will come to some ideas about spatially where to think about conservation and restoration. Because there are clearly places in the basin where it's just, it doesn't matter that there were, 4-meter mesquite there in the past, they're just not going to be there again. But there are some opportunity places where, those ecosystems could be conserved or restored.
What about the resolution between these two warring factions, the surface and the ground?
That's like my whole career. Someday I will get them all in a room. Or actually the silverbacks will die and their offspring will all come into a room with me.
So Julian, that's the the future for the study process itself. Now, the question you asked of what happens after, who's going to take action on that, that's a whole separate issue. As of right now, there are no commitments to proceed with any of the recommendations that come out of this study. The plan right now would be for UCI to submit this document in the future to really anyone who will listen. I mean that respectfully. The water master would be at the top of the list, the stakeholder groups, water master being first and foremost. Us, BWP, other stakeholders.
And it'll go through the TAC, we should mention.
We'll see. I mean, yeah, so it'll be a water master process. We hope that that's our intent, is to get the water master to consider this, because we're convinced it's the best available science that's out there. I think just based on what we've seen so far, there's definitely room for improvement. That's being respectful of what's happened in the past, right? So there seems to be something here, so we're going to look to see. And maybe I kind of visualize a series of maps with the various overlays that have the different criteria. Based on the isotope study, here's where they could exist. Based on the, I forget what the other components are, when you lay them all together, these are the super likely areas because A, B, and C all occurred in these areas. Something like that. But what we do about it, there's no funding source, there's no existing component in the water budget for GDEs. So that will all be a TBD, to be determined.
Well,
An
you deserve
opportunity to
applause
make
for
good
bringing,
decisions.
you deserve applause for bringing him here. Does someone like to make a list?
Travis, is it okay? It seems to be. The points you're making about the conceptual model, especially Mott's, kind of go beyond GDEs, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that if I were a farmer, I would be suspicious of the farm package of the model. And I say that as someone who has sat on graduate committees evaluating students who wrote model packages that are out there being used. They know how much water they're pumping, but their water balance on a farm is probably much more complex, and Modflow is probably underestimating some things that are important.
I think that's been confirmed, right? 40%, 42% in year one, 35% in year two. But I pumping, yeah, sure. So the farm package was
But there's
underestimated.
also, we don't have a way of measuring recharge.
Do you know if the farm package has been modified with more recent climate data, like how recently?
That's a really controversial subject in the groundwater world, because the way that evaporation is calculated in these models is that it's simply a dose response, which means that as we change soil moisture, given some atmospheric demand of humidity, different kinds of plants deliver water to the atmosphere at different rates. It's a simplistic approach because it's a big complex model that's hard to run on computers. So it's got to be cheap and easy. And so the modelers push back and they don't want to change those things. The folks who study the nuance process are very interested in those things, and there's big disagreement about whether or not the product should be changed. No, the effects of climate change are seen in the model through changes in humidity, through changes in soil moisture that comes from changes in the weather forcing of the model, but not in the physics of how plants are like doing things different, because they are different in a different climate.
Where is your local knowledge of Borrego derived? Are you live locally?
So I've been down here since the research center was established.
When was
Up at the old Desert Club on Tilting T, at the end of Tilting T.
Been there since 2012, 13.
that? So you've been here at Borrego.
Well, I come down occasionally. I'm in Irvine. I used to see Irvine. And I'm down. Some years I'm down a lot. Some years I'm not down at all. So
This year more than.
Let's
Let's do it in the next year.
Yeah.
So, Travis, I have a question. We were, our TAC rep Trey, yes, but was telling us that because there's a difference between what's actually pumped versus what was modeled as an estimate.
Based on the data transpiration.
Since it's changed, that they also will have to, they need to balance the water take, the water budget or whatever, that they have to also assume an increase in recharge
Yes.
to make up for that. And I'm having a hard time with that. And why would you assume that?
Well, that's
pumping more.
so that model holds a whole lot of assumptions, and the approach people use is one of mass balance. It's just as like we should be able to add up where all the water is. And so if any part of the model behaves wrong, then another part has to compensate for it, and it's also wrong. So if the model is underestimating pumping, and what we're assuming is all pumping is going back to the atmosphere, then somewhere in the model, and if groundwater elevation is staying the same, or if we're predicting it well, then somewhere in the model, there's more water coming in. We're missing it. That's one answer. It's the most likely because it's consistent with the GE.
I think that's what the reasoning is, yeah.
But there could be other things too. So for example, there is an estimated flux of water out of the bottom of the model. Bedrock's not like impermeable. Water goes into bedrock, but it's a small constant flux. That's what we assume. So that could be wrong. The geography of the bottom could be totally different than we think, which changes the surface area over which that flux occurs. That can be an order of magnitude different in the loss of water in the bottom. So water could be not being lost through these assumed outflows. A big one is the OQL subbasin, right? So that's a convenient dissection of the basin because we assume that the flux across that is a constant. It's constant enough that it serves our purposes to act as a boundary. Right. Maybe the flux across it is lower or bigger, right? Like, and that's so Trey's. What I'm saying about GDEs and what Trey is saying about the pumping discrepancy, they're very similar. My gut is that recharge is higher, that at the mountain fronts, there's more surface groundwater connectivity than the model gives credit for. That recent plant die-offs is actually having an impact in recharge. We see that in other settings. It's analogous to when there were fires in the mountain front. You burn the mountain front, more water enters the landscape and makes the groundwater. If half of the mesquite are just unhealthy for a decade, they don't use as much water, and more water makes it to the groundwater. So these are kind of the adaptive things that something like mod flow just doesn't have. And that's okay. Like, it's just not this. It's the first pass.
So you also, I was also interested in what you said about the retention basin. That's just before you get to the end of it. And a real big flood just creates a new flood.
Right.
There are a number of people in the community who feel like we're missing out by letting floodwaters flow. They see a need for retention basins, like one at the base of the Coyote Creek Wash before you get to the community. And I'm just wondering if that is something that should be considered. To me, the fact that it flows gives it more chance to go into the ground rather than holding it and letting it evaporate. But I just, that is often talked about, that we're losing out by not capturing the floodwaters when they come.
Yeah, so I would frame that question. I agree with you. And in fact, I think over millennia, those flows create macropore structure that leads water to the groundwater. So absent development in the basin, we would expect flows from Palm Canyon and Coyote Creek to actually be more efficient at recharging the basin, absent development. Because development does nothing but slightly divert it, right? And so, and you can see this in from Google Earth in the 2003, 2005 timeframe, where you can watch the ash flow out of the watersheds and see how far and where that ash flows down Coyote Creek and down Palm. And what it does is it just like channels around like Airport Road into Giorgio, like completely, that whole area that Volkswagen is dead. Like all that channel flows out around it. And so I agree with your assessment. If in a perfect world, if we could just let it go down those old channels, that's the best of all worlds. The worst of all worlds is us diverting it down every south-facing street. Because there, the water is not doing anything, but likely sitting in the unsaturated zone or ending up in areas like, ending up in the salt cedar that's running north-south on a lot of these sites and being transpired. So so the concept of a detention basin makes sense. But to me, it would be managing this like spatial structure of streets and new channels more effectively. That makes sense. Yeah. So I agree.
Do you anticipate ever there being a date, not certain, but approximate, when a reasonable profile will exist of the subterranean areas of Borrego Springs? Is the science available for that?
Yeah, but it becomes one of those, like, everything is like a cost effective.
Right, exactly.
Right?
So it's very expensive to do
Very
that.
expensive, so like.
And I think very difficult to accurately model.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, just,
That was really my.
everything is so dynamic, and models just aren't that smart yet.
Well, there's that big LiDAR project that the state is paying for everywhere else, right? Maybe they'll get to Borrego someday.
Yeah.
That goes down, what, 15 or 30 feet, something like that, below the surface.
Yeah, I mean, products like that will help us. One of the biggest things that we can do is get evapotranspiration right from the basin. Like that's the low hanging fruit in the kind of monitoring world. It's just watching all the water leave the land surface. Like, we could do that really easy. It's not hard, and that would be a counter for groundwater elevation as a validation of the model, like model flow. So because it's got to get groundwater elevation right, it's got to get pumping right, and it's got to get water to the atmosphere right. If it does all those, then well, thank you for letting me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did you have any questions, Tammy?
Yeah, thanks for taking questions from directors. Can you hear me, Travis?
Yes.
Part of your presentation was that the current ModFlow model is wrong, which is clear. All models are inaccurate, and you made a case for doing additional modeling. If we look at just our ModFlow model, I'm not clear on what problems we could encounter if we just continue to depend on the ModFlow model. Like what bad things could happen? What opportunities are we missing? I'm missing the motivation for doing the additional modeling suggestion that you recommended.
Well, there's two reasons. One is, understanding that ModFlow is getting some things wrong, and that's okay. It's an important model. We learn from the model, we do new things. And the things that's getting wrong are recharge and evapotranspiration and maybe groundwater elevation. And well,
That's like
you're right.
the main thing.
but I think it's getting, but it may get a storage term right? Like it's not, it's predicting some change in the system well. And so thinking about how those are affected by the conditions of the next 2 decades, I think is important in how the model, what we can rely on from the model. So, it's not getting ET right. It's not getting recharge right. So how is the climate and the physical system in the next 2 decades going to influence those two things? Well, recharge may be constricted because of warmer temperatures and changes in rainfall patterns. It would be better to get that right. It puts us at risk if we don't get recharge right. The ET side of things can be a slow, self-correcting thing. Plants die if they don't have access to water, and so ET goes down. So the model we're less worried about the ET side of the model. So that's kind of like from the nuts and bolts of the model, what puts us at risk. The other thing is that the model doesn't speak to all users. And so all stakeholders are not represented by what the model is providing. And that's where an attempt to do additional modeling, and I'm not talking like uber sophisticated modeling, I'm talking simple, conceptual toy modeling. That's where you get stakeholder buy-in and better decision making by the community. So there's sort of two things to that, if that makes sense, Tammy.
Sorry, no. So I follow that GDEs aren't being represented well, and I have another question on GDEs coming up. But between recreation, farm, and people, I don't see where the model's possibly falling short.
Well, it's falling short in that it's not saying the right amount of water is coming into the system. It's not predicting how much water is entering the basin. Because the only way that it can be wrong with respect to GDEs and the pumping is if water is not coming into the system as predicted by the model.
Okay, so it has recharge wrong. It's got a bunch of inaccuracies. It gets adjusted. I think about back in checking, like you're balancing your checkbook back when we did that, and you just give up and you press the little button that just says rebalance my account and make it meet the bank balance, like just add the fudge factor, realign it to the real world. The model has sort of that equivalent, which will get checked against the groundwater levels. So all those inaccuracies, which we can diminish, we'll never get rid of them all, will always get recalibrated. Like when you recalibrate or you check against your bank account balance, the model will get corrected against the depth to groundwater, and those inaccuracies get adjusted, probably improperly, but nonetheless, we sort of calibrate the model to the real world all the time. So why do I care that one of its inaccuracies is recharge? I mean, it's got all sorts of inaccuracies. I'm missing why I care.
Because when you optimize a model to a single parameter or proxy variable during a time of non-stationarity, what you do is you propagate error into the other components. So the other components become less and less reliable. So as it gets better at basically compensating for how bad it is at one process by being equally bad at another process, it loses its predictive power. It's like when innovation happens in an industry. The ability
So okay, but it loses its predictive power again to the extent that it's going to be calibrated against the real level of the groundwater in the basin. And the groundwater needs to hit to a sustainable yield. I'm just trying.
That's my point right there.
Why isn't that good? Why isn't that good enough? Why isn't that good enough?
You're using groundwater elevation as a proxy for the concept of sustainable yield, and they're not equivalent. Because right now, our ability to estimate groundwater elevation is actually very spatially limited. And that's the key there. So we're building this model to behave relative to a limited data set when we actually have probably better data sets to calibrate the model against.
So the core problem is the measuring the depth to groundwater is not a sufficient way to understand whether we're achieving sustainable yield. That's your position? That's what you're trying to say?
Given the current ability to estimate groundwater depth spatially, yes. If you could estimate groundwater depth at a higher spatial resolution, that would be a totally, that would be a different story.
Right, and that'll get to the number of monitoring wells, right? That could be solved by significantly more monitoring wells.
Right.
That's right.
Not advocating it, it's just.
Yeah, no, yeah,
Right.
it could be. And again, the model then is set up to work in an on average mass balance perspective, which is different than necessarily the way Western hydrology works in terms of variance. So, we expect that these basins fill and drain and fill and drain and fill and drain on decade or multi-decadal timescales. And so, knowing the component processes that are giving us this basin fill is important to understanding that longer term variance cycle. This is the analogy is the Colorado River basin allocation, that you tune a model to what was essentially a wet period, and then its performance during an alternative period is going to suffer as a result. But I mean, Tammy, I don't want to sound like I'm over bagging on mod flow. Like, there's an industry, it's an enormous scientific advance, but there are places where there are blind spots that emerge from it. And for our perspective, the margin is some of the stuff that is of interest to the different stakeholders in the basin, and so we should be careful around those things.
So I think what you're saying, Travis, tell me if I get it right, that if we use just the depth to water, that could introduce, I'm going to make it up, significant lag times in the actual health of the basin. And if we don't understand recharge, then in very dry periods, using depth to water could give us the false impression that we're in a sustainable situation when the slow flow isn't coming in on recharge, and we then get a further dip. We could introduce a significant lag, kind of Colorado River-esque. I'm just trying to state your point that if you use only depth to groundwater and don't understand recharge, there could be a multi-year lag in, the effect of depth to groundwater that we're going to miss, and then we will introduce a non-sustainable period because we didn't understand this. What I'm making up is a lag time. Is that the essence of what you're trying to say, or
Yes.
one of them?
That's one of the essence. Yes.
Okay.
And to
Okay.
flip that,
I got one. I got one.
Imagine very shortly, and I think you're starting to see some wells show positive elevation change in groundwater. There's at least a couple wells that are showing an increase in elevation. We don't want to mistake that for an increase in long-term storage, because if we're getting recharge wrong, these could be ephemeral changes that are at risk of not returning for a long period of time.
Or it could simply be a lack of, or a collapse of
Oh, yeah, it could be a measurement area. Yeah, that's true. That's too. Yeah. So yeah, you're getting it right, Tammy. I think these are just the concerns and in the best world, we knock all these concerns down until we've minimized our worry about them. Not that we throw in law.
Do the directors have any other questions?
Yeah, I have one on I have another sort of basic question on specifically on protecting GDEs. Let's just say that's a goal of some group, and I'm not going to adopt that goal for the next question and try to save GDEs. I guess my point is it too little, too late? To the extent that let's just accept the premise that we do have groundwater dependent ecosystems, and that big green section on your map that we're looking at is, you know, all viable mesquite trees, and the rate at which we're pumping is still diminishing the groundwater table lower and lower below those roots. And if our sole goal was to save the GDEs, it seems like we would need to know how deep those roots go and make sure the water table doesn't drop below their depth, part A. And then part B, even if we were able to dramatically reduce pumping, the rate of reducing pumping, we reduce pumping more quickly, so the groundwater settles to its stable state sooner. It seems even if we achieve that because the groundwater has dropped so low, we may be able to save the mature trees because they have the deep roots, but the groundwater is so low that new growth will never survive long enough to get their roots deep down into the deep water table. And that really, if we wanted to save the GDEs, that what we need to do is pump some water up to them and water the GDEs. Is that not the case? Tell me I'm wrong.
You're both right and wrong. And I think the way you're both right and wrong has to do with the spatial variation in the basin. There are places in this basin where groundwater decline has such momentum that there is no way for us to maintain GDEs in those spaces without pumping water and watering an ecosystem. There are places in this basin that are going to be resilient, even in extreme downwater decline. And I'm convinced that areas to the south and the east of the sink are the textural differences across the different aquifer systems leads to resilience of those ecosystems. And the GDEs will persist, even with more decline in groundwater elevations. That's my hypothesis. And then I'm also convinced that there are places like you described where we will run into demographic problems, where we will have an established system with no recruitment. And we will have to decide how we manage systems like that in the long run. So, but I think that all those examples are happening in different locations in the basin. And in the long run, land ownership, conservation decisions, and those are going to be the way that we see GDEs persist. Where ABF has acquired land that will allow for easy conservation will be a Hail Mary. Where we can, land ownership is comfortable with the loss of the landscape of that land surface type, then that's a win-win. But that'll all play out spatially.
So
Thank you.
basically not one answer for
No,
GDs.
there's not one answer. In fact, the water district's already doing it. You're watering a part of the basin that's fostering a land surface type that didn't exist there. And that's great if you want to conserve GDEs. Some of the water you're returning to the groundwater system is being evapotranspirated into the atmosphere. That's whether you should take credit for that or not is a question.
So, I know that if you have a lot of questions, Travis is available for offline discussion. I am. So I'm going to find.
David,
And,
can't.
oh, and go ahead.
Well, I do have some questions while he's here, but it's not related to the memorandum. If I could ask those questions.
Can I ask for public?
Yeah.
Is there any member of the public that has questions for Travis on the subject? Just wanted to make sure. Okay, go ahead, Dave.
While you're here, you had made a request to the water master to have access to monitoring wells. In anticipation of some pushback on granting that access, I have a couple of questions, and I'm going to ask those same questions at the meeting on Thursday. Sure. And the first is about liability. Are the researchers covered through any sort of insurance policy to the university that they're dealing with?
Yeah, the university is a self-insured entity of the state, and all, they're covered under an official work status for anything that happens while they're
Okay. Good to know. The other question is in regard to the access itself. The water master, the access agreements that the water master has are either for water master staff itself or contractors to go individually. Would you be comfortable going with water master staff or even BWD staff to take those samples?
Yeah, of course. In fact, we are thrilled to do this collaboratively. Like, we'd rather do it with people.
Well, those monitoring events occur semi-annually. So in the year and a half that you have left, you'd be looking at basically 3 opportunities. I mean, is that sufficient?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, you identified 36 wells. 10 or maybe 11 of that are actually controlled by BWD. I think that as a board, we would certainly grant you, unlimited access actually to those BWD controlled wells.
That would be great. And our request to the water master has been one of thinking about process more than anything, making sure we're transparent and knows what we're asking for.
Well, I mean, even though that it's agendized as a public comment, I want to give you an answer on Thursday. And I'm going to push for giving you an actual answer, yay or nay.
That's great. That would be great. An unanticipated question, a question I anticipate is that all 36 wells every year is not necessary. If the monitoring the water district and the water master does is a subset of those, that's fine. And it's wells throughout the years.
Yeah. Okay, good. I just wanted, while I had you here, to be able to kind of frame up the request on Thursday. I appreciate that.
Kathy, can I add some information? So Travis, we just dug up here at BWD a big list of wells in the valley. There are about 260 or 70 of them, I think, in this Excel spreadsheet. And it does have latitude, longitude data. I think a fair number of them are over just west of the sink. Are you interested in seeing that?
Absolutely. We've been scouring data sets to find more well data closer to the sink, including wells that are not productive don't stay alive in the ground in the monitoring perspective, right? But for our purposes, we just need a sample. It doesn't have to be a relatively productive well, and it can be shallow because it doesn't have to be a productive well. So for our purposes, that would be a lot of information. That'd be great.
Okay.
Have we warned Travis? Thank you so much for coming in and talking to us. This was fascinating,
Thanks for having me.
very informative.
I'm always available to talk about this stuff.
So, will you go to give the same presentation to the water master?
I can, and I'll give this to anybody, anytime.
So,
Including,
It might be pretty good for the open house one.
that's what I was thinking as well. So mark your calendar, June 14th.
on my calendar already.
Because that'll be an in-person one, and that would be great to talk about.
I'm happy to meet and talk with anyone beforehand. And so if there's a water master director or two that you think I should help me with them, I'm gonna really like you all pay my salary. I work for the state, right?
Well,
You're a
thank you.
businessman.
Thank you.
You're a businessman.
Oh, I don't. I'm a public employee. I wish I did.
Thank you.
Thank you. But I'm happy to send you an email or something.
Okay, thank you so much. I just really, really appreciate it. All right. Are we ready?
Yes.
To move to the next item on our agenda, which is item 2B. Don't feel obligated, Travis.
And hear all your
You
nuance.
are free to go.
And then I'm just, okay.
Save your sanity and get the hell out.
Yeah, exactly.
I love small community governance. Don't even know.
Keep it real.
Thank you guys very
No,
much.
thank you.
Thank you.
So 2B is the labor
Yes.
compliance consultant
Yes.
for the wastewater treatment plant monitoring wells.
Yeah, so that is actually another Prop 68 project of ours, would be the drilling of, what is it, 6 monitoring wells, 2 locations on 3 sides of our percolation ponds, a shallow and a deeper depth 40 and 100 feet respectively. The project has begun, and just with the transition of Mr. Dale, I realized that we hadn't started our labor compliance work. The good news is the project hadn't started when I figured this out. We just had not completed the contract for our labor compliance expert. They've helped us on really every other grant-funded project we've done, the wastewater treatment plant, the tanks that are going on now. And if there's one area where we could have an oops that would make all of our reimbursables non-eligible, it would be, oh, you didn't pay prevailing wage, or you didn't provide or comply with provisions of the Davis-Bacon Act, various specific potential pitfalls out there. So we contracted our contractor who's worked on all of our other projects. We received the attached proposal. Actually, they've already begun the work just because the contractor had begun and we wanted to make sure we didn't fall behind. So it would be, I would still, yeah, we need the work done. It's so darn important. So the good news is we're covered. So we're not behind the 8 ball already. The work has begun as the construction began. This is just and we're sole sourcing it once again just because their expertise, they know it very well, and to solicit and to recruit other vendors would be not possible at this point without risking the whole grant eligibility.
So is there an actual form that needs to be filled out and submitted by a third party? Testifying to compliance?
There are a number of forms. I didn't look at the detailed attachments, but as soon as I talked to this paper expert a week or so ago, they already started firing emails back and forth with the contractor. The contractor has already provided information, so yes, there are specific points and documents. Esma might have a better feel for exactly what happens. And thank you very much. Esmeralda and I have taken on the wastewater treatment plant project, construction and contract management work, so thank you very much, Esma, for all this stuff.
Yeah, they're good. There's forms that they've been interacting. They keep me in the loop, so they've sent the required forms that they need to get information about their personnel and the trainees and the training that they're having through them to make sure they have them on the list so that there's nobody that's not on there that's going to get paid for the grant. So all our members are supposed to be on.
Okay. And that's been helped with getting our project number, right? The first
Yes.
step was getting the Department of Industrial Relations project number, which allows us to start. So it's been over that a couple weeks ago.
So what you're looking for is a motion to approve 12,800? Then I so move.
I'll second. Any discussion? All right, I will, if there is no further discussion on this motion, I will call for the question.
Should we ask the public for comment?
Oh, thank you. Is there any members of the public that would like to comment? Hearing no microphones being unmuted. I will call for the question to approve the 12,800 for the labor compliance consultant. Director Baker?
Aye.
Is that an aye?
Let's have it,
Director Duncan?
Aye.
Director Johnson? Aye. And I also approve. But we didn't, you didn't.
Yes.
So, and thank you, Esmeralda, for your work on that as well.
And all this expense will be grant funded. It's all part of project administration. You will get paid back going forward.
And 2C will be the Borrego Springs Road and Sun Gold pipeline design.
More good news, if we all recall, what was it, last December, we received $4.3 million out of the federal omnibus bill that kept the budget going, kept the federal government going until what, about now, or the next few weeks. It got us this far. And so, as part of that project, we're the replacement of all the pipelines in the Sun Gold area, where Julian lives, just coincidentally, he happens to be sitting here today. And then installation of a new transmission main in Borrego Springs Road from Walking Page to Rango, out in that area, heading east. And so those projects are currently planned to be 80%, I'll call it grant funded, because this wasn't a grant, this was a direct congressional appropriation. This is an EPA administered program. And so we would have to come up with 20%. The good news is, since we are an SDAT community, there's the possibility for us to apply to get the 20% waiver. Just that part of the procedure hasn't happened yet. But as soon as that period opens up for us to request the waiver of the 20% co-funding, we'll do that very first day. But sitting here today, we're going to have to come up with right about $800,000 out of our cash flow to fund our 20% of 4.4 million. So part of the process, in essence, the first step is to begin the design, development of the plans and specifications. And so staff is recommending we hire Dynamic Engineering, Carlos Beltran, to provide those services for us. We checked with other consulting firms, and the prices were so dramatically different between what the other firms thought it would cost and what we received from Carlos that they didn't feel like providing a price. The typical estimate for a project of this type would be to consider a 10% of the project cost for design, which is $400-something thousand. And so Carlos and his team have given us a bit more than 155, 300. Yeah, there we go. To provide those services. And it does make sense. Carlos is a relatively low overhead operation. I don't say just he and his brother, because they have a much bigger operation than that.
We've used him before.
He was our district engineer, actually, when David Dale departed, and you will probably see an item on the next agenda for Carlos to become a district engineer. Just because he's from the Imperial Valley, and they just kind of know how to get work done over here, really experienced in desert communities. Like I say, just the overhead's a lot less. So just the hourly rates are dramatically different, all for good reason. We're not getting this substandard product. It's just they're different cost structures. So it just makes sense for us to take advantage of that. And it's kind of that practical component that Carlos knows how desert communities doing construction out there work relatively different on the other side of the hill. So once again, really important to get the design going of these two very important pipeline projects. So staff is recommending approval.
Board?
I'll cut to the chase.
Let's cut to the chase. I need a motion. Public. Oh, thank you. Any public comments?
Tammy's waving at us.
Okay, go ahead, Tammy.
If David Dale were still working for BWD, would he be doing this work?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Yes? Yes?
Yes. Yes,
So-
yes.
Taking a step back, that's $155,000 of cost for real work. No, not arguing the work, but the cost of the salary for a district engineer for a whole year perhaps is similar or maybe even less than the cost of doing just this one project. And I know, assuming that's true, I guess Jeff will correct me if I'm wrong, but assuming that's true, one of the things you talked about, Jeff, when David Dale left, was hiring a district engineer and giving the cost of contractors and consultants. Have you considered pursuing that path more? Have you given up on it? It just seems like we're spending, consultants are incredibly expensive as opposed to having an employee.
Yeah, Tammy, we actually have advertised and I've received 0 response. So for a district engineer with Aqua.
So in my old corporate world, one could hire, recruiters, help, could just hire help to find individuals, given the dramatic cost difference, because this won't be the only district engineering project that we need to do. This is just one of a series. Should we try to hire help to see if we can find a person that normal advertising didn't reach, or just hire recruiters, right? Does it make sense for a water district to do that?
Yeah, sure, anything's possible. And maybe we'll do that before hiring the district engineer. I just want to get going with this specific pipeline design because with this EPA program, it's not the typical grant funding. We don't have, oh, you got to finish in 3 years. This has a expedited timeline associated with it. They want us to be done this year, like this calendar year. So to me, finding qualified employees to come out here is going to take some time. So I just didn't want to wait and risk this entire $4.3 million project and our first EPA funded grant program by delaying the design anymore. So I did it in a perfect world. I wish David would have told me he was leaving. I probably would have offered him more money. I don't know, but things are the way they are. So like I said, I just have to look at, in a perfect world, I'd love to be able to consolidate different needs at this point, but I just can't without risking the overall future of our Borrego Springs Road and Sun Gold project. And this is so unique and so different. I don't want to mess it up. Federally funded, direct congressional appropriation. This is a whole different piece. So you're 100% right. I would still love to help. And maybe we hire David Beltran as our interim district engineer to see if we can find somebody in the longer term. But I'd still like to continue with the pipeline design just because this expenditure is so important. Just to get the ball rolling. Once again, fully grant funded, spending $151,000 for pipeline design is half of what it should. Put on my air quotes, should cost.
It's normally 10%.
Yeah.
That's a huge discount.
Yeah.
So I would say that he's giving us a very reasonable offer.
But Tammy's right. I mean, that's the first thing I said is, God, that was almost 2 years of David's salary for that one pipeline design job. So Tammy, you're right on. I had the same initial reaction. It's just, I won't repeat myself. I just want to keep this project going.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Normal expenses, half of what we should be paying, I guess, when you look at what others would charge us. But you are right on. I had that same thought when David gave me his notice 2 months ago. Just hoping that what I call him, the unicorn or something. We would find the unicorn, the golden unicorn that would want the job, but just have not. But well, I hear what you're saying. It's time to kind of increase the focus on it. So thank you for the reminder, because I kind of mentally moved on, but you're right. We'll give that some more thought and effort, because it's important.
I'm only peripherally entitled to opinion, but I want to strongly support, if I can, Jeff. By pure chance, I'm personally involved in a massive 5.5-year project to replace the water and sewer lines in front of my property in Pacific Beach. And as recently as this week, a 45-year-old carrot tree was potentially threatened because of the work that was being done. I'm commenting on that because I found out by talking to the major contractors doing the work, it's headquartered in Oklahoma, who is doing a very good job, by the way. There are many companies, and this is not directly reflective of Borrego Springs, but in San Diego, there are many large companies that will not do business with San Diego because they don't pay their bills. You, fortunately, are funded, and I'm sympathetic to Jeff wanting to move forward on this, not because I live in Sunville, but I do. It's a very, very labor-intensive project. And the other verbal comment that Jeff made about local labor, trying to get people to do this work is very hard in a desert setting. strongly endorse.
And we don't want to lose this opportunity of funding that we have been granted. So, is there anyone that would like to make a motion?
Yes. Is the public done commenting?
Any other public comments? You're my conscience over here. I'm not hearing any, so, okay.
Acknowledging that it is not a perfect world, I move that we approve the funding of $151,300
For Belton.
for Beltran.
And I'll second.
Thank you, Diane. All righty then. Is there any discussion from the public or directors? Righty, I'm going to call for the vote to approve Beltran at $151,300 to do the design work for the Borrego Springs Road and Sun Gold pipelines. Director Baker,
I say A, yes.
okay. Director Duncan,
Aye.
Director Johnson, aye, and I also approve. Going forward.
Madam President, I did notice we have an operations and infrastructure standing committee, so maybe unfortunately it's standing, so we might have to hold a meeting or two, but maybe I'll ask for their help on the district engineer solicitation, and that happens to be Tammy and Dave, and so I can get Tammy's.
Yeah,
Make sure all
I have no idea about.
Cool. Cool, thank you. I'll use them going forward on this.
Okay.
Okay, Tammy? Thumbs up?
Okay, moving along to item 2D, which is the Borrego Springs Subbasin Water Master Report. Anything to,
You want to talk about our phone call on Tuesday last week?
you talk, I'm going to take a break.
Let's see. So Dave and I had a call with Sam Adams and Jim Markman last week to talk about a couple issues that were of concern to BWB based on kind of comments we had heard in different arenas over the past few months. The first being on the use of best available science in any future water master, and the potential for any future water master involvement in studies done by outside organizations or parties that are directly contracting with the water master. And so we had a chance to ask Mr. Markman and Sam for their input, and Mr. Markman clarified his comments. Jim felt that he was being misrepresented and that he used a few, I think it was 4 key words in his five in his clarification that using best available science is obviously okay. He encourages it. It's done everywhere else, but the water master to be involved, board action must occur first, without prior board approval. I think were his 5 words. So those were very important. And as Jim explained, the history, especially going back to the Tub Canyon and water master staff interactions on the kind of the initial visioning about the GDE project, I think a lot of the concern was expressed because not that they were talking, but there was no prior board discussion or board involvement, or board action or board direction authorizing those discussions to occur. So there seems to be no dispute on the use of best available science now and in the future. It's just the board needs to be involved in the process before the water master staff would be involved. Which, from the staff member's perspective, makes a lot of sense. You've got to make sure that the board's happy before we start doing things, especially with the cost structure. You have consultant billable hours every hour, hour by hour. Special requests cost money for everybody. And so what the water master staff is working on and what they're not working on is of concern to all of us because we all end up paying the bill. So there seems to be no dispute on the water master's ability or inability or any sort of barriers to them accepting using best available science. It just needs to be all acknowledged, approved, and the board is fully aware of whatever the water master involvement is. So that seemed to be a satisfactory answer from our perspective. And that also led to Sam kind of taking it one step further and saying, well, gee, what that means on a practical level is that Sam would like to get some direction from the board on how future items are added to the agenda. Once again, that leads to cost. And theoretically, if anybody, any stakeholder gave or submitted a request to Watermaster staff and there were no procedures to evaluate that request and to determine whether that's something that Watermaster staff can work on and spend money and time doing or not, Sam needs to have those procedures predetermined. Which once again makes a lot of sense from a staff member's perspective, especially with that scenario to where everything ties back to billable hours. Here, it's easy to get an item on the agenda, just ask me. It will probably be put on sometimes if you can make the request the same day the agenda's going out, we'll get an item on the agenda. That's just the way we are, and it's a whole different cost structure and a different approach and style, everything else. But, Watermaster doesn't work in that reality, and everything leads back to cost of billable hours. So I think we did see the agenda come out late yesterday afternoon when we were having Dave, Kathy, and I were having our pre-Watermaster meeting with Mark Jorgensen and Mark Geithner. The agenda did come out as we were having that meeting, and we did see that there is an item on the agenda for how do we add items to the agenda procedure that Sam has put on the agenda. The other issue came up with the conflict of interest. There have been some comments made most recently about potential conflict of interest that I guess I'm drawing this conclusion that could lead to somebody putting their finger on the scale, so to speak, about the outcome of these studies going forward, and that this conflict could impact the results of studies in the basin. Full disclosure, the conflict was between BWD and UCI, and Jim Markman actually had a very accurate and very positive reaction, and that was that he's looked at this situation, and it had been brought up by other Watermaster directors, and Jim Markman feels strongly that there is no conflict between the Watermaster and UCI, that if there is any potential conflict, it would potentially be between BWD and UCI. So the Watermaster is at arm's length. They feel Watermaster Legal doesn't even need to look at whether there's a conflict or not. And that Markman believed that since BWD entered into the contract to allow the GBE study to proceed, that BWD is convinced, and Steve in particular, that there is no conflict. And so Markman basically, it's up to BWD, and he assumed that since the deal had been done, these contracts had been signed between us and UCI for this GBE work, that the district and our legal counsel feels that there is no conflict between BWD and UCI. So it was kind of I'll say surprising, but it was the right answer. I think on both issues, it was the right answer. We had kind of heard different and had different opinions of what these statements had been made over the past few months, but I think after talking to Jim and Sam specifically about it, we got Jim to give us exactly how he feels about it. We heard it straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Well, I think that, in the previous 2 years since the Watermaster was formed, there have been assertions made that science outside of the domain of the Watermaster didn't need to be accepted. And it was refreshing to hear Markman talk about it. That, well, that's not so. That our judgment, our groundwater management plan, SIGMA, and the water code itself all reference using the best available science. That our judgment has no language, including the use of outside generated science. So the assertion that it needs to be controlled or come from within the Watermaster domain just isn't so. And it was good to hear him say that directly. So we will move forward. We will have some discussion about, if in fact there needs to be a process for bringing outside science in, and I intend to, after we have this agenda issue resolved on Thursday, then to make a recommendation that we do have a discussion about, using the best available science, what that is, and how we might get included. So to kind of answer your question earlier about, what's the outcome of the GDE project using CI, ideally, whatever those results are or recommendations made, then would be taken by the water master and then used in the redetermination of sustainable yield moving forward. So previously, people have argued, well, we couldn't have done that. Well, that's just BS. We can do that, and we should do that. We're compelled by Sigma to do that. So ideally, whatever recommendations come out of the study, then would be referred to the technical advisory committee, and then it would be used in the redetermination of sustainable yields moving forward.
Does the board have a contract with University of California?
Which board?
Your board? Our board?
Yeah.
You
do currently.
You do?
Yes.
It's, it's very specifically listed with the Proposition 68 grant.
Yeah.
So
As a
we
sub,
don't have a standing contract with UCI for specific improvements.
So, sorry, I forgot his first
Travis.
name. He's not doing this work pro bono, he's being paid by the university system to service your needs, or is that how your interaction is?
the university is receiving grant money through Prop 68 to do this research. So the researchers who are engaged, whatever costs are incurred, I don't know whether they get it per diem or whatever, how that works itself out. But I mean, he is paid by the university whether he does this study or not. But the study itself is funded by Prop 68 funds.
Sounds like the relationship is very beneficial.
Yeah,
Yes.
one would think so.
Well, we have, I think it's really important to have unbiased science. So whatever the answer is the answer. It's not like one that we want to hear or not hear. It's
I was unaware, but did I sense that there was some friction with someone in the community that you weren't doing your jobs properly? What?
Oh, we often hear that.
Yeah.
That's nothing.
Well, I'm not being facetious.
But I think that there is some concern by the
Really?
part of the recreational community, the golf community, and the ag community that the outcome of this study might not be beneficial to them. Just as he described, people fearing that they're going to get less water because those damn plants are going to get.
And I've heard references during the meeting this morning to Thursday. What's happening on Thursday?
Oh,
That's the water master meeting on Thursday at 4:30.
And Mark Jorgens is part of that group?
Yeah.
Well, that's already fine. Okay, thank you.
Tammy, do you have a comment, question?
Yeah. So listening to the report from Jeff and Dave filling in on Markman, I feel like it was insufficient because Markman said things that we had hoped he would say, or I guess we wanted to say, but I did not observe, and I think I've attended all Water Master meetings, that he never provided that guidance to the board. And so while he may personally feel that, and he may answer a specific question about that, his job working for the board is to provide the guidance that he, in those questions about best available science, and also in the discussions about conflict of interest that at least one of the board members, the Water Master board members brought up. There was no guidance provided by Markman in line with the questions, the answers to the questions that he provided to you. So I sort of feel like that there was almost like no particular use in that information. If he doesn't provide the guidance, then he's not doing the job, and the Water Master's not following the appropriate guidance it should follow because it's not getting it. And that's A. B is, it's good that there's a conversation coming up on adding topics to the agenda, but if I'm wary that it sounds like a criteria for the choice of topics that make it the agenda will be the cost for the water master staff to respond to the topic. And that makes me concerned if I'm reading tea leaves right, because there could be some really significantly important things which are expensive, and that I hope I'm wrong in having this worry that cost becomes a driving factor for which agenda items are accepted by the water master, because I think cost is not the most significant variable that the board should consider when it takes on topics.
Well, it is not a blanket agenda item issue. It is specific to additional items suggested or requested by the Water Master Board members themselves. So if I want to add something to the agenda, then that would be discussed and voted on by the board. It takes a simple majority, yay or nay, whether it's included or not. So it's not just any agenda item, it's a specific item from a specific board member to be added to the agenda. That's what the process will be moving forward. There have been in the past agenda items suggested or requested by board members that were just, that one board member objected to and it was dropped. Or there were items that were, or issues that were suggested to be agendized that were, but there was no process into how to say yay or nay about whether an item should be added or not. So I hope that kind of clears up any confusion. It isn't a broad agenda issue. It is items being requested to be added to by board members.
Okay, I'm glad it's going to vote. I think that is in the end the most important thing. So that's good, Dave. I'm glad to hear that part.
Well, I think Jim he may or may have not been clear in the past, giving guidance regarding best available science. If the board does have a discussion in June regarding how to deal with best available science, I suspect that he will give his official opinion, and I'm going to assume that it's going to reflect what he said to us last week.
And we can always call him.
You know, I mean, if he doesn't do it, or
I mean, ask him to state his opinion.
yeah,
It doesn't
or
actually.
if the board would not consider the best available science, then that becomes something that we could take to the judge in our case.
Diane.
So I want to say a lot the same as Tammy, push further a little on this, that what Mark meant was not being proactive in guiding the Water Master Board about, really need to pay attention to best available science. And that's just an example of I think, the budget of the Water Master being used to control the work that it does. And I think the attitude has been, what we've seen in Water Master meetings is that, well, we're not going to do that because it costs too much money. And there hasn't, Markman, I think, should have been the person to be saying, wait a minute, there's also a sigma. And remember, you members of the Water Master Board, he should be saying, remember that it's your responsibility to implement sigma for the whole basin. And it's not everybody's, the overriding responsibility is not to save money and spend as little money as possible. It's to manage the basin sustainably. So I think what's been happening is that the budget has been used to control, it's been the spigot for.
Can you be specific about that? Can you be specific? What specifically, what issue was determined by the budget?
Well, I think,
understand the case.
I'm not good at thinking quickly on my feet, but I think I've seen it with Sam. the proactive management, thinking about, we need to be managing the valley. We need to be, I liked Travis's analogy of not having a fuel gauge in your car. I've been working on an analogy about how, what the water master is doing so far as far as monitoring, is just monitoring and not managing. So I've been thinking it's something like saying, I'm about to drive from here to Yuma, and I've done some monitoring, and I know that I have 10 gallons in my fuel tank, but I haven't figured out what I'm going to do when that 10 gallons runs out. So, yeah, I can work more on that, Dave, but I think we need to be aware of the budget as a management tool, in effect, or a non-management.
I know that did come up when we were talking about some aspects of the hydrologic model.
Yes.
Well,
And I'm
Water
not.
Master staff wanted to create a new model, not fiddle with the existing model model, but to create a new model.
Right, and I'm not being critical, I'm just saying.
It's too expensive.
Rebecca?
Yeah, are there any comments or questions from the public?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This is kind of directed at Dave Duncan, but maybe generally, and I get it finally, that the discussion about having a procedure for getting things on the agenda had to do with suggestions from other board members of the Water Master Board. But I've noticed that I wanted you to try to help me understand this. I've noticed that people send in correspondence, like for the current Water Master Board meeting, there's two items where people are actually asking to be put on the agenda. And my experience has been that those either don't even get discussed at all. It's just assumed people read it, or it doesn't come up. And I'm wondering if someone's specifically asking for something to be discussed on an agenda, why isn't there any discussion about that? And sometimes things don't get on the agenda, or sometimes they do. It feels very strange as a community member seeing that, just no comment, just move along. So if you could clarify that for me, I would really appreciate that.
Well, Becky, in the past, I think that has been true. I think moving forward, this new process will then allow an opportunity for discussion, whether it comes from the public or the community, or it comes from a specific director. I mean, I'm sure.
So for instance, oh, I'm sorry, David. So for instance, the two letters on the current Water Master Board agenda that are under community or communication from the public, those will actually get addressed at the meeting?
If you're talking about the one from Travis Huxman to have access to monitoring wells, I intend to provide him an answer on Thursday.
And there was something from Dave Duncan, maybe it was not Dave Duncan, I apologize, David Garman, maybe it was the same thing. I didn't read it really carefully.
No, he's just commenting on the fact that the technical memorandum has, if there is a final version, and it's been submitted to the Water Master Board for review. And I intend to ask that there be a presentation like we had here today from Travis Huxman in the future, hopefully on the open in-person public meeting in June to discuss the results of that technical memorandum.
And so at what point would you do that? Would that happen within the same meeting that those public communications occur, or would that happen as a comment that it will be addressed later, or not, no comment at the meeting?
Well, I don't, if we enter into this process, then to actually have it on the agenda would need to be approved. And then it would be another 30 days until it would actually appear on an agenda as an agenda item for discussion or action.
So, but, okay, if it comes in as a comment from the public asking to be on the agenda, you're saying it would be agendized as an item to consider to put on another agenda at the next meeting 30 days later, or did I misunderstand you?
No, that would be correct. There would be a discussion during the meeting that the comment appears, whether or not to put it on the agenda.
So that's something Sam would do. She'll take those comments and create an agenda item for them
With board approval.
for approval, for approval. Okay, thank you. That helps. Thank you.
Yep, Becky, the details are in the Water Master Board packet. The last,
Okay, but yeah,
last 2 pages.
yeah, that just came in, but thank you. I'll look.
Any other questions or comments from the public? Any further questions or comments from the directors? All right, is there anything else regarding the water master that we want?
No, Thursday.
Thursday at
4:30, be there, be square.
Yes, Diane.
Is this where I would bring up that document that I sent around a couple of weeks ago, Jeff, about the domestic wells?
Ad hoc water quality.
Okay. It's not just one.
3H1.
Okay.
Next.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. Jeff, and we'll go down to the section 3, the board committee reports as needed. I don't have anything for budget and audit. We are still waiting the final report. Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. So we hope to present that either this month or early June. And are there any other ad hoc reports or committee reports? I know that Diane has something under H, the Borrego Springs water quality. Would you like to speak to that?
Sure. So there's, okay. A guidance document came out from Department of Water Resources sometime in March that I think we need to factor into general planning, Sigma type planning for the basin. It's called Considerations for Identifying and Addressing Drinking Water Well Impacts. I think that what was the driver for this is the situation in the Central Valley where there are so many small drinking water wells that are in danger of going dry from over pumping. And when Paul Gosselin was here from BWR, some of us might remember he mentioned one of the GSPs, one of the that was shut down, I believe, said, oh yeah, we think there will be about 1,000 wells that will go dry, but they'll just figure it out. They'll drill deeper, right? But it's also relevant to us here because I don't think all of us, all of the stakeholders, except probably the well owners themselves, haven't been considering the effects of pumping on domestic wells. And this caused me, because there's a minimus, and this document makes it clear that all wells, minimus, domestic, whatever, no, drinking water wells have to be considered. So we looked for the list of wells that you might recall that Pete worked on back in the fall of 2019, and he helped us dig it out. And there looks like, as I said, there are about 270 of them, a huge number of which are, well, a huge number are unknown. So we just, and I guess I'm thinking about this in the context of something that's been reported to us. This is secondhand or thirdhand, that some people on the Water Master Board consider drinking water to be the BWD's problem. And I think we need to be making the point that, no, it's a Sigma thing, it's a basin-wide issue. But that's all I have to say at this point. There's lots of outreach talked about, and not just outreach, but actual engagement. I mean, there's putting information in front of people, and then there's trying to get their reactions and concerns back from them, right? And BWR is also focusing on engagement.
Are you thinking that this is something that needs to be presented to the Water Master?
Yes.
Put in front of the TAC, or what is it that you would like to see happen?
I think probably putting it in front of the TAC would be the way to start, if I understand how these procedures seem to be, how that process seems to be working these days. I just sort of read this with my, very limited correction of glasses. I don't know very much about this. In other words, I would like Trey or somebody, or maybe someone at DUDEC, I'm not sure which way this would fall. I think Trey, to really read this document and say, okay, these are the implications of this. There seems to be, I've been studying those maps that are in the monitoring plan, there seems to be a cluster of domestic wells down there at Rango and, just west of the sink. And one technical thing that's mentioned in here is that there need to be representative monitoring wells, and that's what the monitoring plan has worked on. But I'm not sure if when they were looking at representative, if they were thinking about these small wells as well. And so it might be that thinking needs to be broadened. But yeah, I think getting people who know more about this and then getting them discussing it and drawing out the implications for management in the basin. It's not like a burning hot issue, I'm not saying this needs to be done in the next 3 months, but I think it needs to be. This is fleshing out a lot. They actually talk about a socioeconomic analysis in here, which was not mentioned in Sigma. It's fleshing out a lot of both the Sigma law and previous guidance, as they call it, from DWR. And guidance, obviously, that's a careful word. It's not, this is what you have to do, but it's what they're saying again and again in here. You really should do this.
So, Jeff, do you think it would be helpful to ask Trey to read this document and give his opinion? Tammy, did you have any questions or comments?
Did you recommend, Kathy, that the water district have Trey
Yes.
evaluate and get back to us? Is that what you said?
I asked Jeff if it would be useful to ask Trey to review the document, and he has agreed to that.
Okay, perfect. I would have said the same thing. Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Anything else on committee reports? Okay, it's your turn, Jeff. Staff
I
reports.
don't think I have anything new to add.
Oh, no way. Really?
Can you give us some synopsis of the Portland well results?
Yeah, I didn't know what to make of that.
I'm not qualified. I mean, we shared the nitrates as N was 20 parts per million, I believe, it was 85. So I personally haven't known. I just,
Yeah.
no, I asked Trey to include it in. He's doing an evaluation of all the wells, so I asked Trey to do the formula also. So I felt our wells had priority, but at least they're going to be evaluated at the same time.
Has that information been shared with the water master?
They got the results as soon as we got it.
And Trey will be presenting on that in June.
Yes.
Great.
Okay, do we have any closed session items today?
Not really. I can just give a status report real quick on the David Bauer land acquisition. We're still in final negotiations on his agreement. We've received his final comments to our final draft. So we'll have that wrapped up also here by the next meeting.
Wait, are we in closed session now? Am I
We're just
hearing
talking-
this right?
I don't think we're going to
We
need,
are not going to need a closed session today, Tammy.
I'm just giving what I think we were going to
Okay.
talk about, a little brief update on the David Bauer transaction, and
Which is ongoing, so.
we're in the final. We presented him with the final draft, and we received his comments yesterday.
All righty. So.
And that would help Steve, because I know Steve was hopping on a plane to go to Monterey. So that's one of the reasons I'm saying, we can skip it, so Steve can get
I
through.
think Steve has already left.
Yeah, he's driving, he was driving to the airport now, so, yeah. He's a good
Have a
driver.
good trip. Have a good trip, Steve.
Yep.
Have fun up there.
Thank you. Are we
Yeah.
going to do closed session or no closed session?
No. I just gave a brief update on Bauer. We're good.
We're good. No.
To help you out primarily.
Okay,
So go ahead.
thank you all. Take care.
Okay, bye.
Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot, Jeff.
Okay, see you.
Okay, bye. Bye.
And be the fact that they're going to. All right, so are there any last comments from the directors or the public? All right, then, I am going to adjourn the meeting. Our next meeting is scheduled for 9 a.m. on May 23rd. Both online and in person. I will be absent that one.
I will be absent too. I'll be in Toronto.
Okay. As long as there's-
Tammy, you gonna be back in 2 weeks? It doesn't matter, I guess, you can still be gone. Right, we can do 2 here and 1 somewhere else. Are you gonna be back in 2 weeks, Tammy?
I fly tomorrow,
Oh, perfect,
home tomorrow.
awesome. Weather's perfect, not too hot yet.
So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. It's cold this morning, wasn't it?